Let's hope the ice cream truck doesn't come by again while I'm filming. Their current jingle was O Tannenbaum. I definitely heard them playing Jingle Bells the other day. Hello, my band of coyotes. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I am going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of August. In August, I read 12 books, so let's get into it. So the first book I read was, or finished, I had started reading it before, but was We Were 8 Years in Power, An American Tragedy by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This was an audiobook that I had borrowed from my library. This is, I'm looking at my notes here so I can actually be coherent. This is a collection of essays written during Coates' time at The Atlantic and newer essays ruminating on each year of the Obama administration. I didn't love the audiobook format, the way the different chapters were broken up. It was hard to, they weren't broken up based on the chapters of the book, because the book, I think, not being able to see it, was an introduction to the essay and then the essay. But the audiobook was 2 or 3 parts that were the introduction, and somewhere in there was the start of the actual essay, and then that would be broken up into 2 or 3 parts depending on how long it was. But I didn't love it. For that, it was interesting to hear his perspective on this period of time when Obama was in office. I think his essay, The Case for Reparations, is particularly relevant right now. I mean, it's been relevant for a while, but I think there's parts of that conversation that are being distinctly brought to light again with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I thought that there were some very insightful reflections on both Barack and Michelle Obama. Some criticisms, which is good. I think it's good to not overly idolize the people that you respect. So there were some criticisms in there, but also a lot of points of respect. He goes a lot into each of their backgrounds. It's also interesting to see the various details that allowed Obama and Michelle Obama to be the statesman people that they are. And to see how a lot of the privilege that they had was kind of at odds with a lot of the Black community in America, because it was just an interesting experience to hear someone examine, the way in which Obama was, by the nature of being the first Black president, somewhat representative of all the Black people in America, but also examining how much of who he was and his experience was so vastly different, because, of course, Black people are not a monolith. So to see in the ways that he was able to speak for those people and criticizing the ways that he chose not to, I liked it. I would like to get a physical copy of it, because I would like to go back and be able to not have to deal with the audiobook format, but also if there's a particular essay that I want to read again, to be able to really pick that one out and just read that piece. Anyway, that was the first book. The second book I read was A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliot. I won a Kindle copy of this in a Goodreads giveaway. I had heard about the release of this book through Thunderbird Woman Reads, who has a bookstagram and has recently started making YouTube videos. So I added that book to my to-read list, and then got a notification that there was a giveaway, and I entered into the giveaway, and I got a copy, which is really cool. So I'm gonna just read the little blurb about this book. In an urgent and visceral work that asks essential questions about the treatment of Native people in North America, while drawing on intimate details of her own life and experiences with intergenerational trauma, Alicia Elliot offers indispensable insight into the ongoing legacy of colonialism. So it's a collection of essays of Elliot that usually starts with some personal experience and then relates that to how that is indicative of her experience as an Indigenous woman, and seeing the reflections of colonialism in that experience, also specific instances of sexism and classism that, you know, may not necessarily be unique to the Indigenous experience, but was definitely shaped by that. And then I left a review on Goodreads, and they say, there are books you can read in a day, and then books you choose to read in a day. This collection of essays was beautiful, heartbreaking, and hopeful. Elliot's discussion of her biracial identity made me feel so seen in a way I wasn't expecting. And her final interactive essay, that particular one is going to stick with me for a long time. So, yeah, I love the writing. This is a book that was newly released, so if that sounds interesting to you, now's a great time to go show it some love. So the next book I read was Their Dogs Came With Them by Helena María Viramontes. This is a book that I already owned, and I think I read at some point, and I didn't remember anything about it, so I was reading it again. It follows 4 women and the brother of one of the women in a fictionalized 1960s East LA. I left a review of this one, and I said, this fictional snapshot of Chicano East LA in the 60s and 70s is detailed, gritty, and as another reviewer put it, viciously beautiful. The writing style does not follow a traditional narrative flow, rather each chapter feels more like following a train of thought of the character in focus. Those thoughts move between details of their surroundings, observing their current feelings, and drifting back and forth in time between past trauma and current revelations. The fictional events surrounding the quarantine authority carry a relevant symbolism in regard to the over-policing of marginalized communities. I liked this book. I liked it more than I was expecting for a book that I hadn't remembered at all, but I also think that my current interests and current circumstance have given me a better lens to appreciate this book. Kind of case in point, I had a very emotional reaction to another reviewer's description of this book, or their reaction to this book. So a snippet of their review said, I wish more stories were told of Latinos born in LA, of parents that pushed education and actively decided to stay away from essentially all of the characters in Viramontes' novel. Especially at a time when other Americans are so quick to say that we are all in gangs, this is the last story I want to read. Now that, like, my emotions have kind of cooled down, I understand this perspective is coming from somebody who wants to see more variety in the ways in which Chicano and Latinx people are represented in a lot of the books. A lot of this is due to racism in publishing. It's, for a lot of own voices writers, their trauma is what's marketable. They want to hear, the heavy stories. They want to hear, about the gang violence, and they want to hear about the poverty, and they want, because it makes for captivating storytelling for what they expect to be a primarily white audience. So I sympathize with where this reviewer is coming from, but, now I have the understanding of why are there so many of those books and not as many of these other books? And a lot of it has to do with who the publishers pick up. So with that in mind, I have a lot more sympathy towards the characters in this book, and I feel like kind of protective of them, because as, negative these characters are, they're still based on a reality, there are still people in these communities who are in gangs, who are drug addicts, who are, victims of poverty and sexual trauma, and, their stories are still, like, just as valid. And just because they're kind of uncomfortable to look at doesn't, I don't know, like, they're still very much worthy of respect. I like this book. I'm glad I reread it. The writing style was unusual, and I think a little bit difficult for me to read. I feel like the wandering nature of the narrative meant that my attention would sometimes wander fairly easily. It didn't quite make me want to read everything that this author has ever written. I am glad to have read this one. So the next book I read was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This was also borrowed from my library. This is the second book I have read by Erin Morgenstern in my last reading wrap-up, and my first video, my 3-book wrap-up, I talk about The Starless Sea, which is the first book that I read from her. So I don't have a summary of this story, so let me see how coherent I can be. So this book follows a magical circus that, to most of the audience or circus attendees, they don't really know that it's magic. They just know that it's amazing. It's like magic. But the magic is the arena for 2 magicians who have been put in competition with each other. They were chosen and trained as children to be, these magical gladiators, for lack of a better word, between these 2 other older, powerful magicians. But, the 2 children who are now adults, they were magically bound into this contract to be in competition with each other. So they didn't choose that. And that becomes an aspect of the story, is they are tied to this competition, but they didn't choose it, and they don't really know how to escape from it, and also how to escape from it without causing harm and destruction to all of the other people who now live within the world of this magical traveling circus. So once again, Morgenstern is amazing at beautifully detailed world building. Just, talking about the design of the different tents, the design of the costumes, the clothing and the costumes is so delicious. It's just, if you are somebody who has a very strong visual imagination when you read stuff, like, her work is so much fun. This story took me a little bit longer to kind of get into, rather than The Starless Sea, though it might be because I kind of knew what to expect from her work, so I wasn't, like, as immediately captivated by the magical world, because I knew that it was going to be a lush magical world. So maybe I wasn't, like, so amazed by that initially. But the hook that got me personally was they were describing the goal of creating the circus as theatrics sans theater and immersive entertainment. And okay, well, that was a thing that clicked for me, was describing this whole experience as theatrical. And I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I work in professional theater. I work in theatrical production. So as soon as like they made that comparison, I was like, oh, okay, yes, now I am fully invested. I still understand the nature of spectacle as storytelling, and how do you make an experience be a story that, this audience member tells themselves as they walk into the room and they see things and they read things, and like, how do you tell a story with a bunch of pieces scattered? It's an interesting thought. I also loved the romance in this. It was a wonderful slow burn of these 2 characters who should be at odds with each other but are also drawn to each other. and want to escape, but they can't. And yes, it was beautiful. It was magical. Lovely. Great. Okay. So the next book I finished. This one had taken me a while. This was like my on my nightstand kind of dense technical book to help me fall asleep, because after a couple pages my brain would be tired and start to fall asleep. So this is Isaac Asimov's The Universe from Flat Earth to Quasar, however that's pronounced. So this is a book that's like a general introduction to the science of our solar system and the greater universe. It was published in 1977, so there is probably tons of information that is no longer accurate or has been developed significantly. But this was a good, like, foundation. There's some moments where, like, he goes into, like, the math of calculating stuff, and my brain is just kind of like, nope. But it was, one of my great takeaways was learning how past astronomers figured out the shape of our solar system and how they measure distance and the size of space objects, before the invention of computers and before X-ray and before infrared technology, but also like learning how all of those technologies came to be developed. And so I've probably like already forgotten like 80% of it, but like I feel like I have a good groundwork for understanding how we learned that our planet is round and we orbit the sun, not things orbiting us, and here's the shape of the solar system, and here's the shape of the galaxy, and here's the shape of the universe, and so on. The next book I read was also borrowed from my library. I did not read it on my Kindle, I read it on my laptop because it had I knew it had like a bunch of illustrations and graphs and stuff in there that I didn't think were going to show up on my Kindle. This was She Came to Slay, The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. This is an illustrated kind of middle grade reader that had a very, very strong like black girl power narrative. But it did talk about, who Harriet Tubman was, how she escaped slavery, the traumas of her life as a slave, how she came to go back and like free upwards of 70 people from slavery over her lifetime. And then all the stuff that I didn't know was all of her involvement in the Civil War. She was a nurse for a long time. She did a bunch of espionage for them. The work she did as a public speaker to raise support for the abolitionist movement, her relationship with other Black American anti-slavery leaders like Frederick Douglass. So there's a whole bunch besides the Underground Railroad freeing of the slaves part that I didn't know about. And also knowing, like, even though she worked as a nurse and worked in espionage for the Civil War, she had to fight for years to get any recognition as a veteran of the war and to receive benefits. And it was a great, very simply written. Like, it's simply written in the sense that it's aimed at like middle grade readers, but it doesn't pull its punches. It talks about what Black Americans experienced in slavery and what they experienced during the Civil War and what they experienced in the aftermath and how much work they were able to do, but how much work still needed to be done. It was sweet, and it was very much like not just a biography of Harriet Tubman, but very much a biography of a powerful Black American female figure for, modern young Black girls to see and to feel empowered and represented by the story. So it was great. Yeah. Okay. And the next book was an audiobook from my library. This might be the favorite book that I've read all month. This was Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. Oh my god, it's so good, and the narration is so good, and I definitely wanted to pick this up on audiobooks because I was hearing Bowties on Books gush about the narration and how once they started listening to this story, they were just gonna like listen to it like while they were doing some errands or something, and then they just like lay on their bed and listen to it for like another 8 hours because it was so good, and the story is so good. So the story follows Felix, who is a trans teen in New York attending a summer intensive at an arts high school. I'm very jealous. I wish I had gone to an arts high school. I think I really would have dug it. Anyway, so Felix very much wants to experience love. He wants to experience all the ups and downs. And I appreciate that this narrative didn't just paint love as like, you know, falling in love is this amazing thing, but also like, no, like it can be very intense and like breaking up is super heartbreaking. But Felix, with his artistic soul, like wants to experience the full range of emotions, wants to know, you know, what can that depth of experience bring to his life and to his artwork. And also like he sees his friends like, you know, being in relationships and hooking up, and it's just like, am I worthy of love? So that's like the broad setting, and then like the conflict of the story is he gets outed at his school when someone posts photos of him pre-transition along with his dead name. And something I appreciated in the story is while they talk about his dead name, often it's never said. Like, you as the reader never learn what his dead name is, because why would you need to know that? His name is Felix. I haven't really read a lot of books yet with trans characters, so maybe that's like a common thing that happens when writing sensitively about trans characters, but like that was one thing that I'm like, yeah. In the quest to find the perpetrator of that action, that is a catalyst for a strange love triangle and like a bunch of other adventures that happen over the summer. I was just living vicariously through this young adult experience. Like, there's peak like New York in the summer. There's like a key moment near the end that happens at the Pride Parade. So much talk, like peak art school. Is it just me that like I wish I went to like an artsy alternative school and had like photography class and drawing class and sculpture and anyway. There's just a lot of like young people being free and affirmed in their identities. Like, Felix is not the only queer person. Oh, Felix is also Black, queer, trans. And as much as he wants he, him pronouns and is like, I'm definitely not a girl, there is another little storyline of Felix kind of re-exploring his gender identity and learning that like you don't need to like choose one thing and be there forever. You can kind of keep exploring and find the things that fit you, which is great to hear. It's just great to like be affirmed in that. And also, like, a lot of people, in talking about this book, they also bring up that a lot of his friends, like, still have a lot of biases and prejudices, and some of them, like, are trying to be nice, like, trying to be respectful, but not really understanding, like, what those boundaries are. Like, especially as young people, like, they're all still kind of learning what their own boundaries are so that they can place those boundaries with the people around them. As much as like these kids were, you know, so open and accepting and affirmed in their identities, it was also great to see how much they were still learning and how much they were still figuring out. So 10 out of 10. If you wanna like I'm not crying, you're crying because I'm so fucking happy kind of story. Felix Ever After. It's amazing. Okay. Moving on. The next book I read, nowhere near so happy, is Aztlan in Vietnam, Chicano and Chicana Experiences of the War, collected by George Mariscal. So this is another book I already own. This is an anthology that, it's an anthology that showcases over 60 short stories, poems, speeches, and articles. It's the first anthology of Mexican-American writing about the U.S. war in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. This was published in 1999, so, when it says the first anthology of Chicano experiences, it was published in 1999. So the preface and the intros were eye-rollingly academic. Just like, how long a sentence could you make? How many, 5 or 6 syllable words could you use? It was so dense. It was, yes, there were some, interesting insights in there about particular readings, but it was just interesting to see the contrast between, these highly academic writings and then the rest of the stories, the letters, and the poems that were all very easy to read and just a complete different tone. I found that there were a lot of common themes between a lot of the writings, but maybe that's the point. One of the things that this book talks about is it's hard to get a lot of data about Chicanos, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, other Latinx populations in Vietnam because they statistically were not a separate category. They were lumped in with whites. But, there's a common theme of a lot of these people, these Chicanos, especially the people who came from farming communities, they go to Vietnam and they're like, yo, this is my family. These peasants in the field look like my family in the fields in California or in the fields in Mexico. There's multiple accounts of Chicano soldiers getting injured and almost getting left behind because in the mud and the blood of battlefield, their white counterparts roll them over and think that they're Vietnamese because they're brown. It doesn't occur to these people that just, hey, they're wearing an American uniform. Are they American? They're just they just see a brown face and they're like, oh yeah, that's the enemy. So, and I was saying, the common themes are the point in terms of it's important, how often, how what these universal experiences are and, how often it happened, how often, there was the racism within the ranks and then, the racism of going across the country to fight someone who is not that different from you. Why are these our enemy? Why are we sacrificing our lives to fight these people who, for the grace of geography, are not that different from my own family back home? Barring the denseness of the intros and the preface, I would say, should you choose to pick this up, I think they're still worth reading because I think they do kind of give examples from the different readings, and tying stuff together and giving some good insights. So now the lighting looks really different because my phone ran out of memory and then the construction started again. So now it's 5 hours later once the construction has stopped and I've already had dinner. So, all right, we got 4 books left. All right, so the next book I read was The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This was an audiobook from my library, narrated by the author. I really enjoyed the narration. It's a very sweet coming of age and coming of identity story about a mixed-race black queer boy in the UK who comes to really explore his identity while doing drag once he gets to university. It's lovely. I know the physical book has illustrations that obviously were not present in the audiobook, so at some point I would like to look at the physical book and see what the physical book had to offer. And while this is just like a lovely story, I only gave it 4 stars instead of like the 5 stars that I gave Felix Ever After, just because it didn't quite tug at my heartstrings quite as much. Again, like I mentioned, like I really liked the narration. I think it's kind of written in verse. I know that there are portions of poetry written by Dinata. I should say that this is a memoir. It's not fiction. It's a memoir of the author. So, important detail. There are portions of Dinata's poetry that he wrote as he was growing up. So the narrator's understanding of the rhythm and the tone of the writing really adds to the audiobook experience. The next book I read was Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. This is a newly purchased book. I don't know when the video will be going up, if it's before this one or after, where I show my little August book haul, but this was one of the newly purchased books that I bought in August, and then I already read it. This is the second book I have read by Emezi. I discussed Freshwater a little bit in my last reading wrap-up thing. So this is a young adult sci-fi fantasy novel that follows Jam, who is a black, trans, mute-ish, neurodivergent teen in the city of Lucille, where there are no more monsters. But then she brings a creature named Pet to life from one of her mother's paintings, and Pet is there to hunt a monster who is hiding in plain sight. I fucking love Emezi's writing. Their writing is so amazing. It has like so much like movement and so many amazing metaphors. I'm going to read a little passage from the book, just because I loved it so much. So, in this passage, Jam is talking to her mother, who is named Bitter, and she's asking questions about the angels, who are the people, kind of like the heroes in their city, who were responsible for outing the monsters and sending them away. Our angels, she signed, the ones here, are they good? Are they innocent? Angels had to be innocent, right? Wasn't that the whole point of them? To be good and innocent and righteous? Bitter tilted her head, and something sad entered her eyes. It's not easy to get rid of monsters, she said. The angels, they had to do things underhand, dark things. The sadness in her eyes deepened, and Jam took her hand, not understanding what pain was coming up, but feeling its ripples in the air. Hard things, her mother continued. You can't sweet-talk a monster into anything else when all it does want is monsterness. Good and innocent. They not the same thing. They don't wear the same face. So, that's kind of like the tone of the book is there are actions that are right, that are necessary, but they are often not easy, and they often don't fall into the binary of good or bad. It's like the thing that needs to be done is going to hurt someone, but it's going to prevent more people being hurt. So this book is a very, simple, because it's a kind of a young adult narrative, but also like very timely examination of what does it cost to enact real change in a society. So fucking love it. I need to read everything that Emezi writes. Yes, love. Great. The next book I read is Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. This was another book borrowed from my library. This is the first world in the Sixth World series. Rebecca Roanhorse is a Native American author, and she writes a lot of books featuring Native characters. So this book, the series name, The Sixth World, refers to this current era of humans on Earth. in the book, there is the big water, which is a big catastrophic climate flooding event that has ended the fifth world. So now we are in the sixth world, in a Navajo reservation that is protected by these magical walls. So this book follows Maggie Husky. She is a Dineta, which is the word for Navajo. She's a monster hunter. She teams up with Kai Arviso, who is a young man who has some unusual medicine man talents. They team up to track the source of some powerful monsters that were clearly created. So they are tracking the witch or whoever they suspect is the one making these monsters. This has very interesting manifestations of Diné mythology, some really fast action. It's got like some convenient plot points, but like it's an action genre, you know, like it's about just like getting to the next monster, getting to the next big fight. So, you know, I don't really mind that there's some, oh, she magically managed to survive this really bad fight, or like, oh, they need to like break into this thing. Turns out that Kai also, you know, is not just a pretty face, he can also pick locks, you know, like, you know what, like we're all just here for an exciting time. We're not going to worry about all the little convenient plot points. I've heard some people describe it as like, it's like a, you know, a Navajo Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I totally get that. I was also kind of thinking like Witcher meets the Dresden Files, if either of those genres, you know, are things that you like. Hey, maybe this thing is up your alley. I'm already on the wait list for the second book in the series. I think there's only 2 books out so far, but yo, this was cool. I'm definitely going to be reading more of Rebecca Rowan Horse's work. Now I want to mention a very strange little moment I had in reading this book. So in this book, Rowan Horse uses kind of fictionalized names of different cities and regions because the whole world has kind of been upended. So, for example, Albuquerque is now just referred to as like Burke. It's, you know, it's not the city that it was. It's, you know, new iteration is now referred to as Burke. In talking about like the American Southwest and Mexico, Rowan Horse refers to it as Aztlan. Does that sound familiar? That's the title of this other book I read. So Aztlan, hold on, let me read what it is in case you don't know what it is. So the earliest indigenous Mexican chronicles refer to a region to the north of present-day Mexico City known as Aztlan. Aztlan, theoretically, was the mythical origin of the first ancestors. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Aztlan became a powerful myth with diverse political and cultural usages. At the height of the Chicano movement in the 1960s, Aztlan garnered tremendous symbolic weight as the stolen homeland and future nation of the Chicano people. It refers to a region and communities that have historically been erased from foundational narratives of American culture. And so on and so forth. So, I see this word, you know, this is very, very much like a deliberate word choice of Rowan Horse to call, you know, the Mexico and, you know, the region immediately north of it, to call it Aztlan. Like, that's a deliberate choice. And that is a word that, you know, was present in Mexican mythology, but also had a pretty common usage, I assume, in the Chicano civil rights movement of the 1960s. So I click on the word on my Kindle to highlight it, and because I highlight a single word, it pops up the dictionary, the New Oxford American Dictionary. No definition found. Very much like a slap in the face to see that what is supposed to be like the most comprehensive English American dictionary out there not have a definition for this word. And, you know, I'm sure it just slips through some kind of criteria, like it's not really an American word, but, you know, you can read all these books with all of this great representation, but then there are still like these huge, powerful institutions that remind you how big of a wall there still is just by what words they do and do not choose to include. That was a moment I had in reading this book. Moving on. All right, so the last book I read, I kind of like read on accident. I picked it up like the afternoon of the day that I finished Trail of Lightning, and then I finished it like right before I went to dinner. And that book is Indio by Sherry Garland. This is another book that I owned and I supposedly had read, and I didn't remember a single thing about it. This follows an indigenous girl in what is now the American Southwest named Ipa, and she struggles to survive a brutal time of change as Spaniards begin their conquest of the indigenous cultures. This is partly historical, partly fictionalized story that brings the late 1500s to life, chronicling the virtual extinction of the native Indio and the birth of the Mexican people. So first off, I didn't like the writing. It was very stiff, very formal. I know you're kind of like trying to portray like a time gone by, but like the writing was boring. And the characters were very much a stereotype. Our main character, Ipa, is very much the like noble savage, which is like, you know, she has knowledge of like plants and great appreciation for the myths and is very caring of her family, but she's also like way too forgiving of the people who kidnap her into slavery and sexually assault her family and, you know, beat and starve her brother. And when she's taken to the silver mines, and, you know, she, with her healing properties, goes to train with the Catholic priests who have established a missionary there. And, you know, within like a year or two, she's, you know, a good little Christian. And like, there's not really any examination of the fact that like your whole culture has just been stolen from you, and now this new one is imposed upon you, and like, you're not even going to question whether this thing is real. So anyway, I'm getting kind of ahead of myself. So while I didn't really like the writing style, it is an interesting historical snapshot of the traditions of Ipa's culture and the methods of Spanish colonization across this region. So, you know, like I mentioned, like, you know, the conquistadors would come and, you know, decimate a village and capture a bunch of people and bring them to be slaves for silver mines, for cotton fields, for sheep farms to make wool. You know, I mentioned the Catholic missionaries that created a religious conversion, and a lot of the rhetoric of the religious conversion was instilling a sense of obedience in them, where it's like, you know, you need to be patient, stealing is a sin, violence is a sin, lying is a sin. Not only are they like discouraged from using their own language, but when they bring slaves and captives from all different regions, well, now their only common language is Spanish, so of course that's what they have to speak. Also, like, the sexual assault of women and the children who were born of that, and then also, like, the consensual, you know, romantic unions and the children who were born of that. So, I had another reaction to a Goodreads review with this book. There's not a lot of Goodreads reviews. There's only, like, 6 or so that actually like type out the reviews, and a lot of it is people being like, I read this like 20 years ago, I don't really remember much about it. But there was someone who started out saying, I think I remember that like this was like a really sweet romance, and I saw that and I'm like, Karen, it's not a fucking romance. This person then acknowledged at the end where they were reading like the little inside the book jack, and they're like, oh boy, I am remembering this wrong. I definitely need to reread this, and I will update my review once I reread it. So, but also, I'm sorry, I have to judge that, like, what you remembered was the romance, this kind of brutal story about the methods of colonialism in Mexico and the American Southwest, and what you remembered was the romance. Again, like, it is a good historical snapshot, and especially, like, the most interesting part is, like, the last quarter of the book, when you're really seeing the lasting ramifications of the Spaniards' presence in this region. Like what I said with the language, Spanish is now their only common language, so slowly their, you know, traditional language is dying out. And also, like, there was a description, Iba was describing, like, the white cotton tunics, or the wool tunics that they wore, tied with a bell. And, you know, now when I think of any photographs or any, like, American Western movies that portray the Mexicans or the indigenous people in those regions, they are wearing, like, the white cotton, like, pants and loose shirt, or, like, the white cotton dress with the cording, and that's the clothing that came about from the cotton and the wool farms that were overseen by the Catholic missionaries. I got 3 stars for, you know, the purpose it served as a historical snapshot. Take a shot every time I say snapshot, but don't really. Take a shot of water. There we go. So yeah, so this one is going to go into my little basket over here of books to sell or give away at some point, just because I feel like there's going to be better books out there that kind of serve the same purpose, that have writing that I'm going to enjoy more. Cool. So those are all the books I read. In summary, I read 12 books. 6 were from the library, 2 of them were new, and 4 of them were pre-owned from my little TBR shelf right here. Great. Finally. Anyway, let me know if you've read any of these books, if you want to read any of these books and you're excited to do so. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I hope you get to learn something cool today. Remember that Black Lives Matter. There's still a pandemic. Wash your hands. And in the description box, I will have a list of all of the books I mentioned. I will have a link to bail funds across the U.S., and a link to my Instagram if you want to interact with me there. Okay, have a good rest of your day, or good evening, because it is now evening for me, and I will talk to you guys in my next video.